Welcome and thank you for joining us for a virtual conversation with the artist Andrea Dezsö and with Sean Burrus, Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. I'm Anne Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. And today, as we face a global pandemic, we have an opportunity to think about the resources that art can confer in a time of uncertainty. We're delighted that Andrea can join us today to speak about her extraordinary exhibition, The Visitors, and the larger implications of her series as we think about art in a moment of crisis.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for those wonderful words that will frame what I'm sure will be a equally wonderful interview. I want to share with you briefly a few remarks about Andrea's practice. Andrea is an artist of incredible talent, remarkable range, and a seemingly boundless curiosity into things past and present, and the hidden and unseen forces that animate our lives. As Anne mentioned, Andrea's creativity and curiosity are on full view in the exhibition, The Visitors, an exhibition at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, which Andrea curated this year while serving as Bowdoin's 2019 to 2020 Hallie K. Harrisburg and Michael Rosenfeld Artists in Residence. It was an immense pleasure to work with Andrea on that exhibition, and we are delighted to be joined by Andrea again today. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Anne and Sean, for having me again. This is the residency that keeps giving. I enjoyed my time at Bowdoin so much, and here now we work together again.
Wonderful. Well, it's wonderful to see you again. Andrea, could you tell us a little bit about what attracted you to Bowdoin in the first place and share a little bit about your experience last summer as artist in resident?
I was very excited when I got this honor to be the Hallie K. Harrisburg and Michael Rosenfeld Artist in Residence for 2019-20 at Bowdoin College, mainly because, well, there are several reasons. One is that the residency was at a college that I highly respect. Bowdoin has a wonderful reputation. It has a wonderful art program, a museum, and all the facilities that I could just imagine being very exciting for an art practitioner. The fact that it was a residency embedded in an art program in a liberal arts college was one of the main components that made this residency really special for me. The big difference then was that when I arrived in the summer to Bowdoin, on day one, I came down with shingles. Except we didn't know it was shingles. We just knew that I was terribly sick. And I was really trying to get into the studio, but it was really very difficult for me to sit, to stand, to do any kind of work. And ultimately, a couple of days into my residency, when we did get a diagnosis and we found out that it's shingles, by that time, the disease was really quite bad. The experience was so painful and so difficult that I was completely lost in it, and all my energy went into being able to just get through each day. But by the end of the 2 weeks, the third week, I was able little by little to return to the studio, and I was really craving that studio experience after all this time of just really focusing on getting through a day of suffering each day. The experience of working in the studio was really that last week the way I imagined all 3 weeks would be going.
Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your impressions of your arrival at Bowdoin with us. I wondered if you could speak with us a little bit about some of the imagery that you ended up developing in the work that you created in response to your experience at Bowdoin. And we're delighted that you're speaking with us today from your studio, and wondered if you might be able to give us some perspective on how the imagery you developed in your series, The Visitors, which grew out of this experience of the unexpected bout of shingles, how it relates to imagery that you've developed more broadly in your career, and perhaps speaks to your artistic practice as a whole.
Sure. The way I worked with the visitors was a specific way that I haven't worked before. And what was different and unusual is that I haven't worked with watercolors quite in this way before, where the watercolor was the main medium for a painting, and where I tried to use materials that felt unfamiliar to me on purpose, because just the way the experience of dealing with this illness and experiencing my body through the various levels and layers of pain sensations was very different and disorienting, something that I didn't really have a knowledge of how to navigate. I felt that using materials such as watercolor and paper such as this kind of origami paper, which is half cotton and half kozo, that behaved very differently than the way I would experience paper to behave. The paint kind of spread on it in a particular way that I feel was disorienting, but it was also beautiful. I wanted the way of working and the materials I was working with to reflect that disorientation and that groundless experience where I wasn't able to turn to what I know.
Andrea, it sounds like the experience of the shingles virus had a very significant impact on your artistic practice. And I wonder if you might reflect on that a little more by speaking about one work in particular. Perhaps Some Things Remain.
One of the things about shingles, which I learned when I got it, is that it's a virus that somebody can get when they get chickenpox. And so oftentimes if somebody gets, for example, chickenpox when they are a child, which is when I had it at around maybe 9 years old, that virus, once you heal from chickenpox, it doesn't actually leave your body, but it lives in the base of your spine or in the base of your brain in waiting. I started from the character in the front, who is this child figure, and the way I experienced my adult self kind of growing out of this child self and connected through this experience of pain and of the neural network in some way. And then the third person is also me kind of looking at this situation. So there's these three people, the child self, the adult self, and the adult self, like looking and reflecting and kind of embracing this situation in all its kind of unusualness. There's all these heads on the bottom, which for me were ways of understanding or ways of processing the different quality of the pain that can arise in the body, the different kinds of expressions, the different characters or qualities of these faces. And so what I was after is not to represent illness the way it looks from the outside, but very much to create something that translated the way things felt from the inside and how I experienced it on a bodily level.
Andrea, thank you so much for speaking with us a little bit about what this experience of shingles felt like for you physically, emotionally, and intellectually. I don't know if you might be willing perhaps to elaborate on that still further as we turn to another very striking piece in the exhibition, Neuron People.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Indeed, in this particular piece, I tried to get to the feeling of the nerve pain that I was experiencing, which was on one side of the body. It was like the full right side of the body. And this piece started with couple of monotypes, the black, three black neuron-like shapes in the middle of the piece were monotypes that I did the first or second day at Bowdoin before I knew what was going on. And interestingly, I was trying to work with neurons or trying to depict some kind of neurons. And then I got sick, and I looked at this monotype that had these three shapes, these neuron shapes, and started to work on it with watercolor. So that was also new for me, to combine the monotype with this kind of watercolor. And the way I felt about this painting was I was trying to express or to translate the feeling into a painting of trying to deal with this feeling of pain in a particular way, which I found that worked for me on some level while being in that experience. And that was to kind of imagine this parallel body that was in pain, that had experienced all the pain, while the other body was protected, and that body was safe and it was all right. And so sometimes it was very difficult to visualize or imagine these two bodies, because the pain body was very much overwhelming the safe protected body, and they kind of collapsed into one. But every once in a while, I was able to just kind of imagine that this pain body, who was at the same time me, was lying next to this other me who was okay. And so I was able to kind of experience that there was this other really healthy other person just kind of there, while I was in this kind of sorry situation. But in many cases, these two just collapsed. Like in this one, you can see those two collapsed bodies into one, or one is kind of looking like the husk of the other, with all the parts that were painful really drawn out in that kind of red neuron-like feeling.
Andrea, that's very, very interesting to think about. One of the things that strikes me as we look again at your these wonderful watercolors from our current perspective, where as a society we're facing the COVID crisis, is the question of uncertainty and the value of knowing what we're dealing with. It strikes me that a lot of what you might have been doing through this art I think you're referring to here is processing and classifying in some ways what you were feeling and experiencing. And I'm mindful too that there was a moment in time at which you began this series that you didn't yet know what it was that you were dealing with. And the monotypes in neuron people come from a moment when you were not aware or didn't know a diagnosis of what you were experiencing. So I wonder if looking at another work, looking at one of my favorite pieces, the Tin-Headed Pain Tree, I think it's really a very expressive piece. If you would reflect on whether it helped you to know the diagnosis, whether having a way to put a name to the illness marked a turning point for you.
I think in a way it did, because it kind of put the whole experience in a particular container that has a particular set of boundaries. So knowing in the case of shingles, knowing what can happen, like knowing kind of the general thing that can happen, but also the worst that can happen, and right now, and then what can happen a year later? Can this come back? What does it like? What does it feel like if it comes back? How do things turn out in the worst case scenario, in the best case scenario, in the general scenario? Made things a little bit more bearable. I feel that when we look at the body of work of the 9 paintings, from the early ones to the later ones, this was one of the later ones, I feel when I look at them that the earlier ones are much more inarticulate. They are much more kind of fuzzy, I would say, in a way that the characters or the kind of anthropomorphic figures that are on them are much more where I was really searching for a form for this particular experience. And I feel that as the series progresses or as the body of work develops, I have some characters that return, or I have some more confidence in articulating what these different qualities of pain look like. And so I had the one with a big eye that had the blue hair, and it had like, that was kind of a major character that was with me a lot. And then I had the little ones that kind of just came up as little accents that had their own kind of mood, but were not there all the time. And then the way they related to each other, the way they kind of, it's almost like a map for me of how things kind of feelings grew out one from the other. And so I guess I could almost read this as a map for myself of what it felt like. But as I continued with the series, I became much more, I feel, familiar with these various visitors that came and that were part of my experience.
Andrea, your comments are quite extraordinary and deeply thought-provoking. And perhaps on that note, we can turn to a fourth work from the series, the piece that actually gives title to the exhibition as a whole, a piece entitled The Visitors. It's really exciting to hear you speak a little bit about the development of the series. And I wonder if you could help us to understand why it was so important for you to turn to art and creative practice as a way for grappling with what for you was an unprecedented experience.
Thank you. And so I have a few thoughts on this. On one hand, I find that often there's, especially in American culture, a very strong desire or push to kind of make lemonade from lemons, right? Like you have a bad experience and then you still make something good with it. And it speaks to our cultural belief in resilience and in like making the most with whatever we are dealt. And I appreciate and admire that sentiment, but I don't necessarily feel that that was the impetus for this. So I'm talking about this because when I put my work up on social media or I showed it to friends, oftentimes I got that response of like, bravo, this is how you make something bad, good. And the reason why I just want to talk about it is because I think there are many experiences in life and there are many instances where there's just a bad experience and there's nothing you can do with it. No matter what you do, it's just bad from the beginning to the end, and there's nothing good that you can squeeze out of it, no matter. For me, I have turned to art and to making art, to my art practice in most of my difficult situations in life. For me, this is a way of processing things. So I might not be better off at the end than at the beginning with some situations, but I'm better off in a way that I feel that I was able to somehow get something out of my body and externalize it and make sense of it in a way that is meaningful to me personally. As I see moving through this series, this is one of the last pieces in that series, and I find in this piece a certain kind of equanimity about what is happening and a certain kind of welcoming of whoever might come. They are welcome. They are okay here. It's going to be an experience that I didn't necessarily want or wish for, but once it's here, there's a way of holding it, even if not welcoming it, and be curious about it, see what happens next.
Andrea, it's such a pleasure to have an opportunity to hear more about the way in which you conceived and developed a certain structure for this series between the time that you were here at Bowdoin during the summer and during the period of months after you had this experience. One of the things that I find particularly magical and stimulating about this series are the different titles that you have ascribed to each of the works. They're powerfully suggestive. In some senses, they're even playful. Could you speak with us a little bit about how those titles came to you, at what point in the process, and perhaps then also how this particular work, The Visitors, came to give a title as a whole to the series?
I usually have a very, very difficult time titling my work, and I often don't. And so the only reason work ever gets titled in my studio is because I need to send an inventory to a show. And so I thought that this time I'm going to do it a little bit differently and see if this can work in a different way. And I just looked at each piece and I went back in my mind, in my memory, to when I made that. What was it about for me and how did it feel? And so I thought that if I could find a title for them that does in words what the images did for the raw feeling that was translated into a visual, if I could translate that same thing into a verbal title that would not try to explain the visual or to point it into only one possible direction, but to leave that ambiguity and that openness to the work, while also somehow alluding to something that was going on at the time. I thought that's how I'm going to do it, and that's what basically what happened. So The Visitors, I feel that with this particular painting, there was a somewhat of a clarification, like something cleared up for me, or something became more, like fell into place somehow, became more understood, or I kind of had this aha moment of, okay, so this is what is going on. And so making this work, as I was making it, this feeling or this idea that I was greeting visitors was the feeling, the experience the whole time while I was making it. So it was, if none of the other paintings had clear and unambiguous titles for me in the series, this one did. This, as I was working with it, it was about welcoming and creating space for strange visitors that might still be coming, whether you find them strange or not, whether you find that these were the people that you wanted to find in front of the door when you opened the door or not, they are here now. And so that was an easy title.
Andrea, it's very interesting to think about the concept of visitors, wanted or unwanted. And I'm reminded of the fact that the exhibition engages with that concept using objects from societies past and present and from across the campus, not only the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, but also the Arctic Museum. You've included pieces of Inuit art and Greek art, as well as indigenous arts from America as well, that engage with similar themes to those that are in your work.
It mostly made me reflect and think more about personal experience of illness and of suffering, especially as I read people's records and people's experiences that they share with others of what it felt like to be ill with this particular terrible virus, the COVID, that we are all afraid of and our society is experiencing on a large scale. It made me think of how one person's small experience, individual suffering, seems so overwhelming and so all-encompassing, but when you think about that being multiplied so many times over how many people are now suffering with much bigger problems and experiences where they don't know necessarily how this is going to turn out. There is no container of knowledge around this as much as we would like to. it makes me reconsider and think more about what we experience and how connected we are.
Andrea, thank you so much for these beautiful observations. It really is an extraordinary honor for Sean and me to have an opportunity to speak with you in this changed world context. And I wondered if in closing, you might speak a little bit about lessons you hope visitors to your exhibition might take away.
The scale of this pandemic that is going on now and the scariness of it is just so overwhelming that I feel that I'm such a small drop in this big ocean that's going on now, the context of the suffering today, that if someone comes to this exhibition and sees what I did and even gets a little bit of encouragement or a little bit of an idea of how to try to record or make sense of what is happening around us now, that would be really wonderful. In some very extraordinary situations, even very small records, very small gestures, then later become more important or more interesting to study or to look at. So I feel that if people create records of any kind, even very ordinary ones, of just a list of what they did one day or what happened or a correspondence or a small sketch or anything like that, on one hand, on a personal level, you can look back at those things later. The way I look back, for me, these paintings are records for me to make sense of a difficult time in my life. But oftentimes we look back at those records either individually or as a culture much later in time, and they are able to really evoke something very human and very relatable.
Andrea, I think what you've just said is so eloquent and beautiful. And one of the things that it brings to mind for me is the incredible power of art to connect individuals and the opportunity to connect people across time and across cultures. And the fact that the gesture of creating something in the face of a moment of incredible uncertainty, I think not only demonstrates extraordinary personal courage, but also becomes a way of connecting with, perhaps providing solace to or inspiration for future generations.
Absolutely, I agree. I think putting one's individual experience into the cradle of a larger experience offers a lot of encouragement and solace and feeling of connectedness. Sometimes that happens at the same time, like I can feel a lot of connectedness to people who are now in the same situation, or I can feel that kind of connectedness across time with people who lived before me or people who will live after me. That connectedness is very real, it's very physical. So there are these traces of the human touch that can speak to us across time, across space, or in our own time, but it's important to make them. I think it's important to keep making them, to offer these kinds of connections and to offer this kind of bridges. And then we are going to able to find these bridges if someone leaves them for us and able to get ourselves to those places and feel that connection in return.
Andrea, on that beautiful note of connectedness and of using art and images as bridges, I just want to thank you for connecting with us again today and continuing to remain engaged with the Bowdoin community and the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. It is such a pleasure to be able to speak with you again. Your art has, in these times, already become a resource for me. And visiting it and re-engaging with it has provided some wonderful perspective on what we are currently going through as a culture. So thank you very much for joining us again today and sharing your courageous art and experience with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.